Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pocho, and today we are looking at new spoiler cards from Dark Frontier. The first spoiler cards from Dark Frontier, in fact. And we have, amongst other things, a new ability that has been spoiled, which is Onslaught. We're going to talk a little bit about Onslaught as well as the cards that we have seen revealed so far with Onslaught. I will say that this time around, for once, the first spoilers out of the new set are in fact really shiny, scary, horrifying legendaries. Like, usually when they spoil, they typically announce and show off like one particular card that's like not quite so flashy, but the first cards out of this set have been like really flashy, and these are some crazy cards. So let's go ahead and get into it. First off, we have Aspect of Destruction, which is our sort of demonstrator of Onslaught, as well as like the basic idea of how this mechanic works. So to explain Onslaught, Onslaught is an ability that triggers whenever you have attacked during a turn. So if you have attacked once during a turn, Onslaught will trigger and you'll get some sort of sweet benefit. It happens only once per turn, so basically you can do it through killer effects, you can do it through any sort of basic attack. If you can get Onslaught to trigger, then yeah, that'll allow you to have a extra benefit at the, I believe it's not, I'm not sure if it's the end of your turn, but it's somewhere close to it. To read the official description, does something when played if you or any of your units have attacked this turn. So specifically it is, when it's played, it's a summon ability, and once you get that whole setup, then like if you actually have that all set up, then you can do some pretty sweet stuff with it. So for Aspect of Destruction, if you have attacked with any number of your units, you can play Aspect of Destruction to ready all of your units, and then they can attack again. And Aspect of Destruction is charged, so it can attack right along with them, which is pretty wild stuff. So for a 7-cost 6/4 with charge, this card is pretty reasonable. Bad News is not a particularly playable card, but if you are attaching some sort of unit to it, then you get some pretty good benefits out of that. Like, I would say overall there's definitely some issues with this card in terms of overall playability. It's not necessarily going to be the be-all end-all of most fire decks, but as a build around me legendary, it's not supposed to be the be-all end-all of most fire decks. I do think that it's definitely got a lot of power in decks that want to be really aggressive with large amounts of scary dragons. If you want to build very scary large red flyers or anything along that type of archetype, that's going to be something where Aspect of Destruction really shines. And it can also come as an interesting surprise in smaller aggro lists that have the ability to ramp out Aspect in some way. Overall, the card is really flashy. It's a lovely looking elemental. It's got some really cool like art to it. I think the stat line is fairly weak for a card that has charge and is a 7-drop, but isn't actually all that awful. Like, this card definitely has a lot of bang for its buck. It's no Zalchi Herald of War, but it definitely has the ability to make a lot of bad stuff happen, and the turn that it's played is really disgusting. Probably the most interesting thing about Aspect of Destruction is definitely playing it in decks with Demand Death. If you can manage to Demand Death into an Aspect of Destruction reliably, which isn't necessarily a thing that you're going to be able to do, you can probably do some pretty interesting things and potentially pull out some really crazy wins from the top. So if you want to do over-to-the-top fire burn, this is definitely the card for you. And Aspect of Destruction as like sort of a show-off card for Onslaught seems really interesting. I think it's kind of not the legendary that you want to get out of your first pack because it's a little bit too build around me, but it's so fun and there's definitely some interesting things to go with it. So despite it not being a terribly powerful card, it's very exciting. This next card is quite powerful, and we're going to talk about it as well. So this is called Pristine Light. It's not quite as bad as it looks, but it is definitely very good. So it is a 3-cost double green with Onslaught. Draw each unit from your void that died this turn, which is important because the card itself reads, kill every unit with 4 strength or more. So it's a small, somewhat interesting harsh rule type effect that also gets back units that are killed with the harsh rule if you manage to attack with those units in a turn. So you can do things like swing with your Vargo, Pristine Light, kill a bunch of your own units, get all of those units back, and then like get crazy wild nonsense out of that whole pile. Or you can swing with Vargo and have Vargo trade with something, Pristine Light, and blow up a bunch of things. There's a lot of cool stuff that can happen there. So, Pristine Light is really clearly playing into some interesting meta styles of Justice. Justice is very good at basically evening out the board against very difficult odds and making itself into a better position from places where it is generally behind. Pristine Light can basically turn a board into a one-sided wipe. You can do a lot of different things to make Pristine Light better, and one of the main things you can do is just play like straight Rakano and blow up everything that's bigger than you to get yourself in for a lot of aggressive damage. That's a pretty reasonable use of the card, and frequently it'll actually work pretty well. I would say oftentimes this is actually going to be a 3-cost to vanquish. It's not going to be as powerful as you might suspect, but it's also something that people have to play around in the same way that they have to play around cards like Harsh Rule. If you do play around this card, it's reasonably strong. It's about as good as a vanquish. It's usually a little bit better in some situations. It has the potential to completely blow out decks that are trying to do really, really big things, and it's just a very fancy market card that you can do some really fantastic things with. This card in the market is particularly disgusting, and that's actually, I think, the thing I like the least about it, is that pulling it off of a Winchest Merchant on turn 6 is a really interesting way to just suddenly clear out everything that's currently causing you problems. So having good counterspells for this, playing around it so that you don't get completely blown out by it, is going to be fairly important. I think this card defines the meta in the same way that Harsh Rule often does, and there are some things that you're going to have to do to play around it. That being said, a lot of the more aggressive decks aren't going to be bothered by this card at all. In fact, they will generally find it really happy for our opponent to have multiple copies of Pristine Light and less copies of cards like Vanquish, which are a little bit faster and kill things like their Skycrag champions a little bit faster. So Pristine Light isn't always going to be the correct choice against the more aggro styles. But it is still a very, very powerful card, and the Onslaught ability, while a dead ringer, like there are a lot of different ways that your opponent can know that you're onslaughting for Pristine Light, is not necessarily something that they can play around too well. The main thing that you can do, of course, is not ever block with tokens against Pristine Light, because anything that's smaller than a 3-drop should generally be used to preserve yourself after Pristine Light occurs. Yeah, this card's very powerful. It's kind of meta-defining. I'm a little sad it's a legendary because it is so, like, ridiculously strong, but at the same time, it also has some definite restrictions, and there are ways in which those restrictions might make it so this card only makes it in as a market card, or like a 1 or 2 of in certain types of decks. Still, I think that it's definitely got a ton of interesting value to it, and like overall this looks like a generally tier 1 card, something you're going to see a lot of in Justice decks to come. Also, that art is fantastic. Like, as far as things go, this is some of the best art that Eternal has put out. Eternal has put out a lot of good art though, so that's a pretty high bar to clear. Nonetheless, this card looks ridiculous. Like, the Paladin on it is, I think, one of the best drawn Paladins that we've seen. There's some really wild stuff going on with it, like the colors are really fantastic. They used the premium version of the card for the card border for their promo this time around, which seems kind of interesting to me. But yeah, overall, like, this card is just glossy and shiny and does... yeah, it does terrible, terrible things. It looks like it's going to be really a staple in Justice decks for the time to come. The last card that was spoiled on Direwolf's Twitter. They didn't give us a full card image of this guy, so it's going to be a little bit awkward, but we should be able to open this up and then resize it. So, yep, there we go. Tazbo the Forbidden, and that's, let's see here. How can I do this? That's about the best that I can get it. Not quite. There we go. That's a little bit better. So Tazbo the Forbidden is a 6/6 Deadly Warp. It is the first card with 5 influence in a particular color, I believe. It's possible there's a 6 influence card. No, I think it's 4 influence for another shadow card, but I don't think there's anything with 5 influence in a particular setup. So this is a monocolored staple card, and there are a couple of interesting things going on with it. First off, it has Warp, which is really unusual. Typically, Warp is a Praxis mechanic. This means that Warp is likely coming back as a mechanic in the set, and also is going to be a mechanic that is effectively color neutral, or at least belongs in multiple colors other than fire and time, which I think is actually a really important thing to note. Warp is a really interesting and fun effect. It's definitely fine on cards of different colors, and I think it's perfectly fine for this card for this mechanic to color shift into other places. It makes some sense in Shadow, especially considering the storyline being primarily about going into the Shadowlands, weird stuff happening there, and generally causing interesting problems. Like, overall, that seems like it's going to be something that, yeah, Shadow's probably going to have a decent amount of warp cards, and that'll probably be generally related to whatever's going on with the Shadowlands. We will see if that's how that goes, but should be something interesting nonetheless. But yeah, Warp is coming back. Warp was a cool mechanic. I'm really excited to see more Warp cards. They do some neat stuff. There's some interesting tricks to them. Hopefully we see some sweet Warp cards. This one is certainly sweet and is a serious monocolored payoff. It is a 6/6 deadly with Warp, and it says whenever one of your other units dies, you draw a card and you take 1 damage. Now, obviously this card is not really playable in multicolor sets. You can play it in some fairly shadow-heavy Stone Scar or Feln, or anything along those lines, but at that point, it's typically not going to be played as a 5-drop, but more as like a 6 or a 7-drop. That being said, it's a pretty powerful effect, so you probably wouldn't be too unhappy to play it that way, especially if you are throwing out like a Devour afterwards or doing something along those lines. If you're playing straight Mono Shadow, this card is A, aggressive, and B, really, really interesting in terms of like helping your other aggressive stuff. Obviously, Tazbo can be killed the turn that it comes out, which is not amazing, but since every time it forces a bad trade, you get to draw an extra card, there's definitely a lot of value to be had with that. You take 1 damage as well, which means that the infinite combos and the infinite stuff that you can do with it is probably going to be somewhat limited, but overall that's not going to be too big of a drawback. It's similar to that of Impending Doom or Argenport Instigator, or not Argenport Instigator, Auric Interrogator, but like basically anything along those lines where you get the extra damage means that you can, you know, basically have some major problems. You can't put lifesteal on this card to get damage reduced, unlike Auric Interrogator. This card does just always cause you to take 1 damage regardless. I think that may not be true depending on how the card determines sources, but that's something we'll have to test when it comes out. Yeah, it's a deadly card, so it trades with basically everything. It is very, very capable of dominating the board in a removal light setup, and it also can gain itself a lot of other interesting shenanigans. You can use Excavate and Xenon to bring this card back to the top of your deck and replay it again, which is nice if you're doing Xenon Killer style decks where you want to actually be sacrificing a lot of your own units to Tazbo to basically like blow things up. If you want to do like deadly killer stuff, that's an interesting way that you could use this whole setup. Yeah, like overall, I think this card's very strong. It's clearly just a monocolored card, and one of the things that interests me about this is what it portrays for the upcoming set. It's quite possible this isn't going to be a continuation of the tricolors that we've been seeing. Right now we've seen 3 very strong cards that are very, very influence deep and very, very monocolor supportive. So like we have a card that is really, really deep in Justice, 3, 4, 2 Justice influence. We have a triple red legendary, and we have a 5-cost 5 shadow legendary, which if it's part of some kind of cycle would probably mean that we aren't going to be seeing quite as much of the 3-color set that we have been seeing for the previous setup. I think that's actually a good idea if they decide to not go into the other 5 triple factions, or introduce maybe only 1 more triple faction, and then go into strengthening up some of the other ones and strengthening up monocolored and dual-colored faction pairings. That might be something that the new set trends towards, considering we are seeing crazy legendaries like this. On the other hand, it's a crazy legendary. It's not necessarily indicative of what the set itself is going to look like. I just think that since it doesn't belong in any type of hybrid color, it's possible that we're not going to see like a big ol' 5-color second cycle of triads, and that in itself could be really, really interesting. Could be a very cool return to a different meta. But that's all speculation. Tazbo is a good card, certainly has some cool stuff going on with it. I love Mono Shadow decks. We're definitely going to play some versions of this with Veteran Merc and a bunch of other ridiculous Shadow card draw stuff. We're probably going to play some Xenon Killers with this. It looks like an interesting build around. It's got some very nasty damage dealing stuff that you can do with it. It's a fun card to steal, because you remove all the influence requirements. And yeah, like overall seems like a fairly solid option as far as what you got going on. So yeah, between this and the Justice card, I'd say, and also like the entire introduction of Onslaught as a mechanic, I would say I'm very, very excited for what's coming up. We will be covering as many spoilers as we can as they come out. I'm not planning on buying any spoilers at the moment. There's like a buy spoilers system in the Influence store. I've expressed some views on the Influence store before, but basically like that doesn't really work for me. We're gonna avoid that if we can, and we'll see what we can do about it. But like overall, there's still the possibility that we'll get spoilers of our own, and we will be breaking down spoilers on stream. We'll talk a little bit more about the Influence store in another video. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. We will be back with more Eternal spoiler breakdowns for sure. We've also got some decks of brewing, and hopefully those will be up very soon. I'll see you guys then. To the YouTube folks, thank you so much for watching. To the Twitch folks, let's get back to some games.